"Just finish me," she pleaded, voice breaking like dried mesquite in the wind. The lonely Apache warrior knelt beside her broken body, and when he tore her bloodied skirt to tend her wounds, he saw the mark branded deep into her flesh, a symbol that would ignite a war between two worlds and change the very meaning of survival in the unforgiving desert of 1847 New Mexico territory. The sun hung like a copper coin against the endless blue sky, casting harsh shadows across the jagged landscape of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. Heat shimmered off the red rock formations, creating phantom lakes that vanished the moment you looked directly at them. This was a land that killed the weak and scarred the strong, where only the most resilient could carve out any semblance of life from the desert's merciless embrace. Akando crouched motionless behind a cluster of barrel cacti, his dark eyes scanning the valley below. His bronze skin bore the intricate tattoos of his people, marking him as both warrior and outcast. The blue and black lines that spiraled around his muscled forearms told stories of battles fought and enemies conquered, but also of the price paid for walking between the Apache world and the encroaching white settlements. His long black hair was braided with eagle feathers and silver beads traded from Mexican merchants, and his buckskin pants were reinforced with strips of rawhide that had seen countless miles of hard desert travel. 3 days had passed since he'd last seen another human soul. 3 days of tracking, hunting, surviving on nothing but jerky and what little water he could find in hidden desert springs. The Apache way was solitude when necessary, but even the strongest warrior needed purpose beyond mere survival. Akando had been searching for something he couldn't name, some sign that would tell him whether to return to his scattered tribe or continue this lonely existence on the margins of two conflicting civilizations. The sound that broke the desert. Silence was so faint that a lesser tracker might have missed it entirely, a soft moan carried on the hot wind like the cry of a wounded animal. But Akando's ears, trained from childhood to detect the slightest disturbance in nature's rhythm, caught it immediately. His hand moved instinctively to the knife at his belt, fingers wrapping around the worn leather handle as he rose from his crouch with fluid, predatory grace. Moving through the desert terrain required a specific kind of skill that few possessed. Each step had to be calculated, each breath controlled. The Apache had learned over generations how to become one with the landscape, how to move like shadows across the burning sand without disturbing so much as a single grain. Akando embodied this ancient knowledge as he descended toward the source of the sound, his moccasined feet finding purchase on rocks that would have sent lesser men tumbling into the thorny embrace of the cholla cacti below. The arroyo stretched before him like a wound in the earth, carved by centuries of flash floods that came without warning and disappeared just as quickly. Desert willows grew along its edges, their thin branches offering precious shade to whatever. Creatures were fortunate enough to find them. It was here, in the deepest part of the wash, where rainwater had carved smooth stones and left behind pools of precious moisture, that Akando found her. She lay crumpled against a boulder like a discarded doll, her once white dress now torn and stained with blood and dirt. Her long black hair spread around her head in tangled waves, mixed with thorns and bits of desert debris that told the story of a desperate flight through unforgiving terrain. One arm was twisted beneath her body at an unnatural angle, and dark. Bruises covered what skin was visible through the rips in her clothing. But it was her face that stopped Akando cold. Young, perhaps 20 years old, with features that spoke of mixed heritage, Spanish and indigenous blood, creating a beauty that even suffering could not entirely diminish. Esperanza Gutierrez had been running for 2 days straight, her feet bleeding in boots never meant for such punishment, her throat parched from lack of water, and her body pushed far beyond its limits. The daughter of a Mexican rancher and a Pueblo woman, she had grown up straddling two worlds, much like Akando himself, never quite fitting into either, but finding strength in the duality that others saw as weakness. Her father's ranch had prospered, through careful negotiation with both Apache raiders and American settlers, but prosperity in the New Mexico territory was always temporary, always dependent on forces beyond any one person's control. The raid had come at dawn 3 days ago, but not from the source anyone expected. Instead of Apache warriors seeking horses and supplies, it had been a group of American soldiers, led by a man whose cruelty had become legend throughout the territory. Captain Marcus Whitfield commanded a unit of cavalry that officially patrolled the frontier for hostile Indians, but in reality served as his private army for settling personal scores and claiming whatever he desired from the scattered settlements. Whitfield had visited the Gutierrez ranch twice before, ostensibly on military business, but his eyes had lingered on Esperanza in ways that made her skin crawl. When the soldiers came that third time, they brought fire and death with them. Esperanza's father tried to negotiate, offering horses and cattle, anything to avoid violence. But Whitfield hadn't come for livestock. He had come for the rancher's daughter, and when Don Carlos Gutierrez refused to hand her over, the captain gave orders that turned the peaceful ranch into a scene from hell. The house burned while Esperanza hid in the root cellar, listening to gunshots and screams that would haunt her dreams forever. By the time the soldiers left, everyone she had ever loved was dead, and she was alone in a world that had suddenly become infinitely more dangerous. Akando approached the unconscious woman with the wariness of a wolf approaching a trap. In his experience, nothing good came from involving himself in the troubles of settlers, whether Mexican, American, or the mixed-blood families who tried to exist peacefully between the competing claims of different peoples. But something about her stillness, the way she lay so completely vulnerable in the harsh desert environment, stirred emotions he had learned to suppress. Perhaps it was the recognition of shared otherness, the understanding that comes from living between worlds and belonging fully to neither. He knelt beside her carefully, his keen eyes taking inventory of her injuries. The arm was definitely broken, and dark stains on her dress suggested internal bleeding or wounds he couldn't yet see. Her breathing was shallow but steady, and when he placed a hand near her mouth, he felt the whisper of air that meant she was still fighting for life. Survival in the desert required harsh calculations. Every decision weighed against the cost in water, food, and energy that might mean the difference between life and death. Helping this woman would complicate everything, would slow him down and use resources he might need for his own survival. But as Akando studied her face, seeing in her mixed features a reflection of his own complicated heritage, he found himself reaching into his pack for the leather water pouch that contained some of his most precious commodity. Water was life in the desert, and sharing it with a stranger was an act of either compassion or foolishness, depending on one's perspective. He lifted her head gently and allowed a few drops to wet her cracked lips, watching as her body instinctively responded to the moisture. Her eyes opened slowly, brown as creek stones but filled with a wildness that spoke of recent trauma. The moment she saw him, his Apache features, his warrior's tattoos, the knife at his belt, terror flooded her expression, and she tried to scramble away despite her injuries. The movement sent obvious waves of pain through her broken body, and she collapsed back against the boulder with a cry that echoed off the arroyo walls. "Please," she whispered, her voice hoarse from dehydration and screaming. "Just finish me. I cannot run anymore. I cannot fight anymore. If you're going to kill me, just make it quick." The words hit Akando like a physical blow. In her eyes, he saw not just fear of death, but something worse, a complete surrender of the will to live. This was not the healthy fear of someone. facing a natural predator, but the broken despair of someone who had already died inside and was simply waiting for her body to catch up. He had seen this look before, in the eyes of Apache women who had survived cavalry raids, in the faces of children who had watched their families destroyed by diseases brought by white settlers. "I am not going to hurt you," he said, in careful Spanish, his voice pitched low and steady. "I'm going to help you." She stared at him with disbelief, as if the concept of an Apache offering help rather than harm was so foreign as to be incomprehensible. Her breathing remained rapid and shallow, and Akando could see that shock was setting in as her body began to shut down from trauma and exposure. Without immediate care, she would die here in this arroyo, becoming food for the buzzards and coyotes that cleaned up the desert's endless supply of casualties. Moving with practiced efficiency, Akando began pulling supplies from his pack. A medicine bundle wrapped in soft deerskin contained herbs and powders that Apache healers had used for generations to treat injuries and illness. Clean strips of cloth for bandages, a small clay pot for mixing healing pastes, dried roots that could be chewed for pain relief. His grandmother had taught him these skills, insisting that a warrior who could only kill was only half complete. "What is your name?" he asked as he worked, mixing ground willow bark with water to create a pain-relieving drink. "I am called Akando." She watched him with eyes that seemed to see everything and nothing, her mind clearly struggling to process what was happening. "Esperanza," she whispered finally. "Esperanza Gutierrez. My father's ranch was—" Her voice broke and she turned away, unable to continue. Akando nodded grimly. He had heard the smoke signals, seen the buzzards circling. Over the Gutierrez land 2 days past. Another ranch destroyed, another family scattered to the winds, or worse. The pattern was becoming depressingly familiar as tensions escalated between the various groups, trying to claim the same territory. "Your family?" he asked gently. "Dead," she said with finality that cut through him like a blade. "All dead. The soldiers came and they killed everyone except me." The way she said it, with such self-loathing and survivor's guilt, told Akando that whatever had happened at the ranch had been worse than simple murder. There was shame in her voice, a burden that went beyond grief into something darker and more personal. He had seen enough of war to recognize the signs of deeper trauma, the kind that branded itself into a person's soul and changed them forever. As he examined her injuries more closely, Akando began to see the full extent of what had been done to her. The broken arm was the least of it. Bruises covered her body in patterns that spoke of deliberate cruelty rather than accidental harm. Her dress was torn in ways that suggested violence beyond what would be necessary for simple robbery or murder. And when he tried to check for internal injuries, she recoiled with such terror that he immediately backed away. "I need to see how badly you are hurt," he said carefully. "Some of these wounds need immediate attention, or they will become infected." "No," she said with quiet desperation. "Please just let me die here. I'm already ruined, already broken. There is nothing left to save." But Akando had not survived as long as he had by accepting defeat, either in battle or in healing. Something about this woman's courage in the face of despair reminded him of his own sister, killed years ago in a cavalry raid, not unlike the one that had destroyed the Gutierrez ranch. Perhaps helping Esperanza would not bring his sister back, but it might honor her memory in a way that simple vengeance never could. Working around her resistance, he managed to clean and treat the wounds he could reach, mixing healing pastes and wrapping injuries with practiced skill. All the while, he kept talking in gentle Spanish, telling her stories of the desert, of his people's beliefs about survival and healing, anything to keep her focused on something other than her pain and despair. The sun moved across the sky as he worked, and gradually he felt some of the tension leave her body as the medicine began to take effect. It was only when he was finishing the last bandage that he saw it. A tear in her dress near the hem revealed a mark burned into the flesh of her upper thigh. Not a brand made by accident or in the heat of battle, but something deliberate and cruel, designed to mark her as permanently as if she were livestock. The symbol was unfamiliar to him, but its purpose was unmistakable: to brand her as property, to ensure that even if she escaped, she would carry the mark of ownership forever. The rage that filled Akando in that moment was unlike anything he had experienced before. He had fought in wars, had seen the worst that humans could do to each other, but this deliberate marking of an innocent woman struck him as a violation so profound that it demanded justice. His hands clenched into fists as he stared at the brand, understanding now why she had begged him to finish her. In her mind she was already dead, marked and ruined beyond redemption. "Who did this to you?" he asked, his voice deadly quiet. Esperanza's eyes filled with tears that she quickly blinked away. "Captain Whitfield," she whispered. "He said I belonged to him now. Said this mark would ensure that no matter where I ran, everyone would know what I was." The name hit Akando like a war club to the chest. Marcus Whitfield was known throughout Apache territory, a man whose cruelty had earned him enemies among every tribe and peaceful settlement alike. Stories were told around campfires of his raids disguised as military operations, of civilians killed and women taken for purposes that had nothing to do with fighting hostile Indians. If Whitfield had marked this woman, it meant he considered her his personal property and would never stop hunting her. Looking at Esperanza's branded flesh, Akando made a decision that would change both their lives forever. This was no longer about helping a wounded stranger or honoring his sister's memory. This had become personal, a challenge that cut to the very core of who he was as a warrior and as a man. Captain Marcus Whitfield had declared war the moment he burned that brand into innocent flesh, and wars once started demanded to be finished. "He will come looking for you," Akando said, not as a question but as a statement of fact. Esperanza nodded miserably. "That is why I ran. That is why I wanted to die here alone. Better to feed the vultures than to be dragged back to him." "No," Akando said with quiet intensity. "You will not die, and you will not be taken back to him. I give you my word as a warrior of the Apache. While I live, you are under my protection." The hidden canyon that Akando led Esperanza to had been a sacred place to his people for generations beyond counting. Carved deep into the red sandstone cliffs by eons of flash floods and wind, it was invisible from the main desert until you were almost upon it. A natural spring bubbled up from beneath the rocks, creating a small oasis where cottonwood trees grew tall and grass stayed green even in the harshest summer heat. Ancient petroglyphs covered the canyon walls, telling stories of hunts and ceremonies, of warriors and medicine men who had found refuge in this place when the outside world became too dangerous to navigate. Carrying Esperanza had required every ounce of Akando's considerable strength and endurance. Even weakened by trauma and blood loss, she was not a small woman, and the desert terrain demanded careful navigation to avoid detection by any pursuing soldiers. He had fashioned a travois from mesquite branches and his spare blanket, creating a makeshift stretcher that allowed him to pull her across the sandy washes and rocky outcroppings without causing additional injury to her broken arm. The journey had taken most of the day, with frequent stops to check her condition and give her small sips of precious water. By the time they reached the hidden canyon, the sun was setting behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reflected off the polished stone walls. Esperanza had drifted in and out of consciousness during the journey, sometimes calling out names of family members who would never answer again, other times mumbling prayers in a mixture of Spanish and what Akando recognized as Pueblo dialect. Her fever had risen as the day progressed, and he knew that infection was setting in despite his initial treatment of her wounds. The cave that served as Akando's primary shelter was located about 20 feet up the canyon wall, accessible only by a narrow ledge that required both skill and courage to navigate. Clearly, carrying an injured woman up that precarious path was impossible, so he quickly set about creating a more accessible camp near the spring. Using techniques learned from a lifetime of desert survival, he built a lean-to shelter against a large boulder, weaving together branches and covering them with canvas he had traded for in Santa Fe months earlier. As darkness fell, Akando built a small fire using wood from the sacred grove, being careful to keep the flames low and the smoke dispersed so as not to attract attention from any search parties that might be scouring the desert. The firelight danced across Esperanza's pale face as she lay on a bed of soft grass and blankets, her breathing still shallow but more regular than it had been during their journey. Her fever was breaking, which meant her body was beginning to fight back against the trauma and infection. Throughout that first night in the canyon, Akando kept vigil beside her, periodically checking her pulse and temperature, giving her small amounts of willow bark tea to help with pain and fever, and changing the dressings on her wounds. But it was during these quiet hours, as he listened to her delirious mumblings, that he began to piece together the full horror of what had happened at the Gutierrez Ranch. The story that emerged was worse than anything he had imagined. Captain Marcus Whitfield had not simply conducted a military raid gone wrong. This had been personal from the beginning, a calculated act of revenge against a family that had dared to refuse his demands. Don Carlos Gutierrez had been a successful rancher precisely because he treated all people fairly, whether they were Mexican vaqueros, Apache traders, or American settlers passing through. This policy had made him prosperous, but had also made him enemies among those who believed that success should belong only to those of pure European blood. Whitfield had first approached Don Carlos 6 months earlier, ostensibly seeking to purchase horses for his cavalry unit, but his real interest had been in Esperanza, and when her father politely but firmly refused to consider a marriage proposal, on her behalf, the captain had made his intentions clear. He would have her, with or without her family's consent, and anyone who stood in his way would be destroyed. Don Carlos had foolishly believed that his connections with both Mexican authorities and American territorial officials would protect his family. The attack, when it came, had been swift and merciless. Whitfield's soldiers had surrounded the ranch at dawn, giving no opportunity for negotiation or escape. They had killed the vaqueros first, shooting them down as they emerged from the bunkhouse, thinking they were responding to a routine military patrol. Then they had set fire to the outbuildings, using the smoke and chaos to prevent any organized resistance. Don Carlos had tried to fight, had died with a rifle in his hands defending his home. Esperanza's mother, Maria, had been shot while trying to reach her husband's side. Her younger brother, Eduardo, barely 15 years old, had been killed while attempting to drive the horses into the hills where they might be safe from confiscation. One by one, everyone she had ever loved had been murdered before her eyes, while she hid in the root cellar like a coward. But hiding had not saved her in the end. Whitfield's men had found her eventually, dragging her from her hiding place, and presenting her to their captain like a prize of war. What happened next was burned into her memory, with the same permanence as the brand that now marked her flesh. Whitfield had not simply taken her by force. He had made it a ceremony, a deliberate humiliation designed to break her spirit as thoroughly as he had broken her family. The branding iron had been heated in the same fire that consumed her childhood home. While his men held her down, Whitfield had pressed the glowing metal into her thigh, marking her as his property with the same casual cruelty he might show when branding cattle. The pain had been beyond description, but worse than the physical agony was the psychological message. She was no longer a human being with rights and dignity, but a possession to be owned and used as he saw fit. As Akando listened to these whispered confessions, his rage grew into something cold and implacable. He had fought in many battles, had killed enemies in defense of his people and his territory. But this was different. This was not warfare between opposing forces, but the systematic destruction of innocence by someone who used his position of authority to satisfy his own twisted desires. Captain Marcus Whitfield was not a soldier. He was a predator who wore a uniform to disguise his true nature. On the second morning in the canyon, Esperanza awakened fully conscious for the first time since her rescue. The fever had broken completely, and though she was still weak from blood loss and trauma, her eyes were clear and focused. She lay quietly for several minutes, taking in her surroundings, the towering canyon walls, the sound of running water, the ancient petroglyphs that seemed to watch over them like guardian spirits. "Where are we?" she asked, her voice still, hoarse but stronger than it had been. "A place of healing," Akando replied simply. "My people have used this canyon for ceremonies and medicine for many generations. The spirits here are friendly to those who seek peace." Esperanza struggled to sit up, wincing as the movement reminded her of her injuries. For the first time, she seemed to truly see her rescuer, not as a threatening Apache warrior, but as the man who had saved her life and brought her to safety. His long black hair was unbraided now, falling loose around his shoulders, and without his war paint and weapons close at hand, he looked younger, less intimidating. There was kindness in his dark eyes, a gentleness that seemed incongruous with his obvious strength and warrior's bearing. "You should have left me to die," she said quietly. "I am nothing but trouble now, a burden that will slow you down and put you in danger." "That is not for you to decide," Akando replied. "Life is sacred. Your life is sacred. What was done to you does not change that." But Esperanza shook her head, tears beginning to flow down her cheeks. "You do not understand. I am marked now, branded like an animal. No decent man will ever want me. No family will ever accept me. I am ruined, destroyed, and everyone who sees this mark will know exactly what I am." The shame in her voice was heartbreaking, but Akando had dealt with trauma before, had seen how victims often blamed themselves for the crimes committed against them. In Apache culture, there were ceremonies for cleansing, rituals that could help heal the spirit even when the body bore permanent scars. But Esperanza came from a different tradition, one that often punished the victim as much as the perpetrator. "Show me," he said gently. She stared at him in shock. "What?" "The mark. Show it to me. Let me see what he did to you." "No," she said immediately, pulling her torn skirt more tightly around her legs. "I cannot. I will not. It is too shameful, too horrible." Akando moved slowly, carefully, keeping his hands visible and his voice calm. "In my culture, we believe that wounds hidden in darkness cannot heal. Only when they are brought into the light, examined and treated properly, can the healing begin. I am not asking this to shame you or to satisfy curiosity. I am asking because I need to understand the full extent of your injuries." For long minutes, Esperanza stared into the fire, struggling with emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. Finally, with trembling hands, she lifted the torn fabric of her skirt. There, burned deep into the flesh of her upper thigh, was a symbol that made Akando's blood run cold. Not just any mark, but a specific brand used by slave traders. A twisted combination of letters and symbols that declared the bearer to be property available for any use their owner might desire. The brand was still red and inflamed, clearly infected despite Akando's initial treatment. But more than the physical wound, it was the psychological damage that concerned him. This mark was designed to destroy hope, to convince the victim that they were forever changed, forever lessened, forever owned by the one who had applied it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. It burns constantly, Esperanza whispered. Not just the flesh, but my soul. Every time I move, every time I think I might forget for a moment what happened, the pain reminds me that I belong to him now, that I will never be free. Akando studied the brand with the eye of a warrior who had seen many kinds of wounds. The infection was serious but treatable. The scarring would be permanent, but scars were not always marks of shame. Sometimes they were badges of survival. But the psychological damage would take much longer to heal, would require not just medicine, but understanding, patience, and time. This mark does not define you, he said firmly. It defines the man who put it there. It speaks of his cruelty, his weakness, his need to hurt others because he cannot face his own emptiness. But it says nothing about your worth, your strength, your right to live and love and be happy. How can you say that? Esperanza demanded, anger flashing in her eyes for the first time since he had found her. Look at me. Look at what I have become. I am branded like cattle, marked as property, ruined for any decent life. What kind of future can I possibly have now? The anger was good, Akando realized. Anger meant fight, meant the will to live, and struggle against injustice. For too long, she'd been drowning in despair and self-blame. If that despair could be transformed into righteous fury, it might provide the strength she would need for the healing process ahead. I see a woman who survived when others did not, he said. I see someone who ran 20 miles through hostile desert rather than surrender to her captor. I see courage, determination, the will to live despite everything that has been taken from you. The mark on your flesh is temporary. It will heal and fade with time. But the strength in your spirit, that is permanent, that is who you truly are. Over the following days, as Esperanza's physical wounds began to heal under Akando's patient care, a delicate trust began to develop between them. She was fascinated by his knowledge of desert plants and their medicinal properties, watching intently as he prepared poultices and teas from roots and leaves that seemed to grow everywhere once you knew what to look for. He in turn was impressed by her quick intelligence and her detailed knowledge of the territory's geography, gained from a lifetime of helping her father manage trade relationships with distant settlements. They talked for hours by the fire, each evening, sharing stories of their respective cultures and the challenges of living between worlds that often seemed intent on destroying each other. Esperanza spoke of growing up as a mixed-blood child in a society that valued racial purity above all else, never quite Mexican enough for the Mexican communities or indigenous enough for the pueblo where her mother had been born. Akando told her of his own struggles with an Apache tribe that sometimes saw his willingness to trade with outsiders as a betrayal of traditional ways. But it was when Esperanza began to speak about her family that the true depth of her loss became apparent. Don Carlos had been more than just a successful rancher. He had been a visionary who believed that the various peoples of the territory could coexist peacefully if they focused on mutual benefit rather than mutual destruction. Her mother, Maria, had been a gifted weaver, whose textiles were prized throughout the region for their beauty and craftsmanship. Eduardo had been learning to be a horseman and dreaming of expanding the ranch's operations into California. All of that was gone now, destroyed by one man's selfish desire and unlimited capacity for cruelty. The ranch would probably be claimed by Whitfield himself, using his military authority to justify seizing abandoned property. The horses and cattle that represented years of careful breeding would be sold or distributed among his men. Even the memories of her family's achievements would be twisted and distorted by those who needed to justify what had been done to them. Sometimes I think the worst part is not the physical pain, or even the fear, Esperanza said one evening, as they watched stars appear in the darkening sky above the canyon. It is the way he has stolen my past as well as my future. My family died thinking I was safe, hidden away where no one could hurt me. They will never know that their sacrifice was meaningless, that I was taken anyway, and everyone who hears about what happened will remember only that the Gutierrez family was destroyed, not that they tried to build something good in this world. Akando listened to these words with growing understanding. Trauma was not just about what had been done to her, it was about what had been taken away, the future that could never be recovered, the relationships that had been severed forever. Healing would require not just treating physical wounds, or even psychological ones, but finding a way to honor what had been lost, while still embracing what remained possible. Your family's memory lives in you, he said gently. Their values, their dreams, their love. Those things cannot be destroyed by violence. As long as you remember them, as long as you carry their teachings forward, they continue to exist in the world. That is a kind of immortality that even death cannot touch. But what can I carry forward? Esperanza asked desperately. I am one woman alone, marked as property, with no resources and no allies. How can I honor their memory when I can barely survive from one day to the next? It was a fair question, one that Akando had been pondering himself as he watched her struggle with grief and trauma. The answer, he realized, lay not in returning her to the life she had lost. That was impossible. But in helping her discover what new life might be possible given her changed circumstances. Survival itself is a victory, he said. Every day you live, every breath you take, every moment you refuse to surrender to despair, that is honoring their sacrifice. But beyond survival there are other possibilities. Your knowledge of the territory, your understanding of different cultures, your father's connections throughout the region, these are resources that could be put to use in ways that honor his memory while building something new. As the days passed and Esperanza's strength gradually returned, Akando began to see glimpses of the woman she had been before the tragedy. Her natural intelligence reasserted itself as the shock and trauma began to recede. She asked thoughtful questions about Apache customs and beliefs, made useful suggestions for improving their camp's security and comfort, and demonstrated a practical knowledge of desert survival that surprised him. But perhaps most importantly, she began to show flashes of the fighting spirit that had enabled her to escape from Whitfield in the first place. When a rattlesnake wandered too close to their camp, she dispatched it with a rock thrown with deadly accuracy. When they're stored, water began to run low. She remembered a spring her father had shown her years earlier, located just 2 miles from their canyon refuge. These small victories were building blocks of confidence, proof that she was more than just a victim. It was on the 10th day of her recovery that everything changed. Akando had been out hunting, tracking a small herd of deer that would provide meat for smoking and hides for winter clothing. When he returned to camp in the late afternoon, he found Esperanza sitting by the fire, with tears streaming down her face. But for once, they seemed to be tears of something other than grief or despair. I remembered something, she said when she saw him approaching. Something important that I had forgotten in all the horror and pain. What did you remember? He asked, settling beside her. My father kept records, she said, her voice growing stronger with excitement. Detailed records of every business, transaction, every agreement with Apache bands, every promise made by American officials. He wrote everything down because he said that someday someone would need proof of who could be trusted and who could not. Those records are hidden in a place that Whitfield would never think to look. The implications hit Akando immediately. Such records would be invaluable for understanding the true nature of relationships between different groups in the territory. They might contain evidence of Whitfield's previous crimes, proof of agreements that he had violated, documentation of murders and thefts that had been covered up or blamed on Apache raiders. Where are these records hidden? He asked. There is a cave system in the Sandia Mountains, about 30 miles northeast of our old ranch. My father showed it to me when I was 16, made me promise that if anything ever happened to him, I would retrieve the documents and take them to a man named Don Miguel Herrera in Albuquerque. He said Don Miguel was the only person he trusted completely, the only one who would know what to do with the information. For the first time since finding her in the desert, Acando saw real hope in Esperanza's eyes. Not just the hope of survival, but the hope of purpose, of being able to strike back against the man who had destroyed her family. Those records represented more than just evidence. They were a chance for justice, a way to ensure that her father's death would not be meaningless. The journey to the Sandia Mountains began before dawn, on a crisp morning when the desert air still held the coolness of night. Esperanza had insisted they leave the safety of the hidden canyon, despite Acando's concerns about her physical readiness for such a demanding trek. Her arm was healing well, but 30 miles of rough terrain would test even a fully recovered person. More importantly, venturing out of their protected refuge meant risking detection by Whitfield's patrols, which had undoubtedly expanded their search as the days passed without finding their escaped prize. Acando had spent 3 days preparing for the expedition, crafting additional weapons and gathering supplies that would sustain them during what might become a much longer journey than originally planned. He fashioned a new bow from seasoned oak, stringing it with sinew and testing its pull until he was satisfied with its accuracy and range. His knife was sharpened to a razor's edge, and he prepared a war club from ironwood, weighted with a stone head and decorated with eagle feathers that would mark him as a warrior to any Apache bands they might encounter. But weapons alone would not ensure their success. The route to the Sandia Mountains crossed territory controlled by various hostile forces, American cavalry patrols, Mexican bandits, and Apache war parties that might not distinguish between friendly and enemy travelers. In the heat of confrontation, Acando's knowledge of the land would be crucial, but equally important was Esperanza's understanding of which settlements might offer aid and which should be avoided at all costs. They traveled light, carrying only essential supplies in packs designed for quick movement across varied terrain. Water was their most precious cargo, contained in leather pouches and clay vessels that could be refilled at the few reliable springs along their route. Food consisted mainly of jerky, pine nuts, and dried corn that would provide energy without requiring cooking fires that might reveal their position to enemies. Esperanza's recovery had progressed to the point where she could walk for hours without significant pain, though Acando watched her carefully for signs of exhaustion or fever. The first day's travel took them through a landscape of stunning beauty and constant danger. Red sandstone mesas rose from the desert floor like ancient fortresses, their tops crowned with wind-carved spires that had stood sentinel for millions of years. Arroyos cut deep channels through the rocky ground, providing both concealment for travelers and perfect ambush sites for those who might wish them harm. Every shadow could hide an enemy, every sound might herald discovery by hostile forces. Acando moved through this terrain with the fluid grace of someone born to the desert, reading signs invisible to less experienced eyes. The bent grass that showed where riders had passed, the scattered stones that indicated a recent flash flood, the flight patterns of birds that might reveal the presence of other humans in areas where none should be. He taught Esperanza these skills as they walked, helping her understand how to become part of the landscape rather than an intruder upon it. Your people see the desert as empty space to be crossed as quickly as possible, he explained, as they paused to rest in the shade of a towering saguaro cactus. but it is actually full of information for those who know how to read it. Every rock, every plant, every animal track tells a story about who has been here and what they were doing. Esperanza proved to be a quick student, her natural intelligence and lifetime of living in the territory combining to make her surprisingly adept at desert navigation. She remembered landmarks from childhood trips with her father, recalled conversations about which water sources were seasonal and which could be trusted year-round, and demonstrated an intuitive understanding of how to move quietly across different types of terrain. But it was her knowledge of human geography that proved most valuable. She knew which ranches were controlled by men who might aid Captain Whitfield and which were owned by families who had suffered under his depredations. She could identify safe approaches to settlements where they might trade for supplies. And equally important, she knew which areas to avoid because of recent conflicts between different factions. On the second day, they encountered their first serious test. Cresting a ridge that offered a panoramic view of the valley below, they spotted a column of dust rising in the distance. Riders moving fast across the desert floor. Too far away to identify, but numerous enough to represent either a large Apache war party or a significant military patrol. Either possibility meant danger for two travelers trying to remain undetected. Akando immediately led them to concealment among a jumble of boulders where they could observe the riders without being seen. Through gaps in the rocks, they watched as approximately 20 horsemen came into view, moving in formation too disciplined for bandits but too loose for regular cavalry. The blue uniforms and military equipment identified them as soldiers, but their behavior suggested they were operating under orders that had little to do with standard patrol duties. "Whitfield's men," Esperanza whispered, her face pale with recognition and fear. "I can see his banner from here. The one with the silver eagle that he claims represents American authority, but really just represents his own arrogance." The patrol was clearly conducting a systematic search, examining every potential hiding place as they advanced across the valley floor. They had dogs with them, animals trained for tracking that would make concealment much more difficult if the soldiers decided to investigate the ridge where Akando and Esperanza were hiding. The situation was rapidly becoming desperate, but Akando had not survived years of warfare by panicking in dangerous situations. He studied the terrain around their position, noting wind patterns, available escape routes, and defensive positions that could be utilized if concealment proved impossible. The ridge they occupied was actually part of a larger mesa system with narrow canyons and hidden passages that could provide concealment for those who knew how to find them. "Can you climb?" he asked Esperanza quietly. She nodded, though. He could see uncertainty in her eyes as she looked at the steep rock face that rose behind their current position. "Then we go up instead of trying to go around them," he said. "They will expect us to flee across flat ground where their horses give them an advantage. They will not expect us to disappear into the cliffs where horses cannot follow." The ascent was harrowing, requiring them to traverse narrow ledges and climb near vertical sections where a single misstep would mean death on the rocks below. Esperanza's injured arm made the climbing particularly difficult, but she gritted her teeth and followed Akando's lead without complaint. Behind them, they could hear the soldiers moving closer, their dogs beginning to pick up scent trails that led toward the base of the cliff. They reached a hidden cave system just as the first dog began barking at the bottom of the cliff, having found the spot where they had begun their climb. But the soldiers, as Akando had predicted, were reluctant to attempt pursuit up the treacherous rock face. After several minutes of shouted discussions, the patrol moved on, apparently deciding that no fugitives could have successfully negotiated such dangerous terrain. The cave where they took refuge was part of an ancient network created by centuries. of water erosion, with passages that extended deep into the heart of the mesa. Petroglyphs covered the walls, images of hunts and ceremonies, warriors and spirit animals, all created by Apache ancestors who had used these same caves for shelter. During times of conflict, being in such a sacred place filled Akando with renewed strength and determination. "My grandfather told me stories about these caves," he said, as they explored the passages by the light of a small torch. "During the Great Wars with the Mexicans, Apache families would hide here for months at a time, emerging only to hunt or gather supplies. The soldiers never found them because they could not believe that people could survive in such a place. They remained in the cave system for 2 days, waiting for Whitfield's patrol to move far enough away to make continued travel safe. During this time, Esperanza shared more details about the records they were seeking, helping Akando understand just how valuable and dangerous this information might be. Don Carlos Gutierrez had been more than just a successful rancher. He had been an unofficial mediator between conflicting groups throughout the territory. Mexican officials consulted him about American intentions. American territorial administrators sought his advice about Apache movements, and various Apache bands had trusted him enough to share information about military activities that threatened their survival. His records contained details about broken treaties, illegal land seizures, massacres that had been covered up, and corruption that reached into the highest levels of both Mexican and American administration. Captain Whitfield appears in those records many times, Esperanza explained as they waited in the darkness, not just as a military officer, but as someone who was using his position to enrich himself through activities that had nothing to do with fighting hostile Indians. He was stealing cattle and blaming Apache raiders, selling confiscated weapons to bandits, and taking bribes from settlers who wanted Apache families driven off land they had occupied for generations. The implications were staggering. If such detailed documentation existed and could be placed in the right hands, it would destroy Whitfield's career and probably result in criminal charges that could see him hanged. But the very existence of such records also explained why he had been willing to massacre an entire family to prevent them from being revealed. He wasn't just pursuing Esperanza out of twisted desire. He was trying to eliminate the only person who knew where evidence of his crimes was hidden. On the 3rd day, they resumed their journey, traveling through terrain that grew increasingly mountainous as they approached their destination. The Sandia Mountains rose before them like a wall of granite and pine, their peaks still capped with snow despite the advancing season. Hidden within those mountains was the cave system where Don Carlos had concealed years of accumulated evidence, but finding the right location would require precise navigation and considerable luck. The landscape changed dramatically as they climbed into the foothills, transitioning from desert scrub to pine forests that provided welcome shade but also limited visibility. Apache war parties frequently used these mountains as refuge and staging areas, which meant that Akando and Esperanza had to be constantly alert for signs of other travelers. Not all Apache encounters would be hostile. Some bands might recognize Akando as a friend, but in times of conflict, strangers were often treated as enemies until proven otherwise. They were following a game trail through a particularly dense section of forest when Esperanza suddenly stopped, her hand gripping Akando's arm with surprising strength. "Someone is watching us," she whispered, her eyes scanning the trees around them. Akando had sensed the same presence, but had been hoping it was simply wildlife moving through the forest. Now, however, he could clearly see movement in the shadows. Between the trees, multiple figures positioning themselves to surround the trail. The lack of immediate attack suggested these might be Apache scouts rather than hostile soldiers, but the distinction could prove meaningless if they were from a band that considered all outsiders to be enemies. "We know you are there," Akando called out in Apache, his voice carrying clearly through the forest. "We are travelers seeking passage through your territory, not enemies looking for war." The response came from multiple directions simultaneously as warriors emerged from concealment with weapons ready but not immediately threatening. There were 6 of them, all young men with the lean build and alert eyes of seasoned fighters. Their leader was perhaps 25 years old, with intricate tattoos that marked him as a member of the Mescalero band and scars that told of recent combat experience. "You travel with a branded woman," the leader said in accented Spanish, clearly recognizing Esperanza's mixed heritage. "What business does an Apache warrior have with Mexican cattle?" The insult was deliberate, designed to provoke either anger or submission. How Akando responded would determine whether this encounter ended in conversation or violence. He had to establish his authority without challenging the other warriors. Pride had to explain their situation without revealing information that could be used against them. "This woman is under my protection," Akando replied calmly, switching back to Apache to demonstrate his fluency and tribal connections. "She carries information that could save many Apache lives by exposing the true nature of our enemies. We seek passage to the sacred caves where her family's records are hidden." The Mescalero leader studied them both carefully, weighing Akando's words against whatever intelligence his band had gathered about recent events in the territory. Finally, he nodded slightly. "I am called Nietzsche," he said. "My scouts have reported unusual military activity throughout this region, soldiers searching for something or someone with great urgency. If you carry information that threatens the Blue Coats, then perhaps we have common interests." What followed was a tense negotiation conducted according to Apache customs that Esperanza found both fascinating and terrifying. Information was shared gradually, with each side revealing only enough to demonstrate good faith while protecting crucial secrets. Nietzsche's band had been raiding settlements to the south, gathering intelligence about American troop movements and supply lines. They knew about the massacre at the Gutierrez Ranch and had correctly guessed that survivors might be seeking revenge. "Captain Whitfield's name is known to us," Nietzsche said grimly. "His soldiers killed 3 of our women last month, claiming they were enemy combatants, but they were gathering medicinal plants, not weapons. This man makes war on everyone who is not exactly like himself, Mexican, Apache, even Americans who disagree with his methods." The revelation that Whitfield's crimes extended to murdering Apache women added another dimension to Esperanza's quest for justice. She was not just seeking revenge for her own family's destruction, but potentially helping to expose a pattern of systematic violence that threatened all the indigenous peoples of the territory. After hours of discussion, Nietzsche agreed to provide guides who would help them reach the hidden caves safely. But he also offered something more valuable: warriors who would help them retrieve the records and ensure they reached their intended destination. The Apache band had their own reasons for wanting Whitfield exposed and punished, and they were willing to risk significant danger to achieve that goal. "There is something else you should know," Nietzsche said, as they prepared to resume their journey. "Our scouts have reported that Don Miguel Herrera, the man you seek in Albuquerque, is no longer there. Whitfield's men arrested him 2 weeks ago on charges of trading with hostile Indians. He is being held in the territorial prison, awaiting trial." This news hit Esperanza like a physical blow. Don Miguel had been her father's most trusted ally, the only person who could have made sense of the complex records and known how to use them effectively. Without him, even recovering the documents might prove meaningless. They would have evidence of Whitfield's crimes, but no way to ensure that evidence reached people with the authority and courage to act upon it. But Akando was already thinking beyond this immediate setback. If Don Miguel was arrested, it means Whitfield knows about the records and suspects their importance, he said, which also means we are running out of time. Soon he will figure out where they are hidden and move to destroy them. The race was no longer just about justice or revenge. It had become a desperate attempt to preserve crucial evidence before it could be eliminated by the very man it was meant to expose. They would have to reach the caves, retrieve the records, and find a new ally to help them reveal Whitfield's crimes, all while avoiding capture by increasingly desperate military patrols. As they followed Nietzsche's warriors deeper into the mountains, Esperanza felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a physical burden. She was no longer just a victim seeking personal justice, but the guardian of information that could save many lives and prevent future atrocities. The brand on her thigh still burned with each step, but now it served as a reminder not of shame, but of purpose. A mark that connected her to all the other victims of Whitfield's cruelty, and a promise that their suffering would not be meaningless. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. The cave entrance was so well concealed that even with Esperanza's detailed directions, it took them nearly 3 hours of searching to locate it among the countless fissures and rock formations that scarred the mountainside. Hidden behind a curtain of hanging vines and accessible only through a narrow chimney that required them to squeeze through spaces barely wide enough for a human body, it was the perfect place to hide something of immense value. Don Carlos Gutierrez had chosen his hiding spot well, selecting a location that would challenge even the most determined searchers. Nietzsche's warriors had established a defensive perimeter around the area, their keen eyes scanning the forest below for any sign of pursuit, while Acando and Esperanza attempted to penetrate the mountain's secrets. The Apache fighters moved like ghosts through the pine trees, communicating through bird calls and hand signals that would be invisible to untrained observers. Their presence provided crucial security, but it also added pressure. Every minute spent searching increased the risk that Whitfield's patrols might discover their location. The chimney descent proved even more challenging than Esperanza had remembered from her teenage exploration with her father. Years of weather had shifted some of the rocks, creating new obstacles and narrowing passages that had once been merely difficult. Her injured arm, though much stronger than it had been weeks earlier, still lacked the full range of motion needed for technical climbing. Twice she became wedged between rock walls, requiring Acando's assistance to extract her without causing further injury. But the greatest challenge was psychological. As they descended deeper into the mountain's heart, the walls seemed to press closer together, and the weight of tons of stone above them created a sense of claustrophobia that threatened to overwhelm rational thought. The darkness was absolute beyond the reach of their torches, and every sound echoed strangely in the confined space, making it impossible to determine whether they were alone or whether something else might be sharing these ancient passages. "Was so much smaller when my father brought me here," Esperanza whispered as they paused to rest on a narrow ledge. "Everything seemed larger then, less frightening. Now I can barely fit through spaces that once seemed enormous." Acando understood her fear, but also recognized the courage it took for her to continue despite it. Many warriors he had known would have refused to enter such a confined space, preferring to face enemies in open combat rather than risk being trapped underground. The fact that she was pushing forward despite obvious terror demonstrated the same strength that had enabled her to survive Whitfield's attack and escape across hostile desert. The main cavern, when they finally reached it, was a cathedral of natural stone, carved by millennia of underground water flow. Stalactites hung from the ceiling like frozen waterfalls, and the walls glittered with mineral deposits that caught their torchlight and threw it back in dazzling patterns. But the most remarkable feature was a series of natural shelves carved into the rock walls, creating perfect storage spaces that had been carefully sealed with fitted stones and waterproof materials. "There," Esperanza breathed, pointing to a section of wall where several stones had been arranged in a pattern that looked natural to casual observation, but revealed deliberate design to those who knew what to look for. "My father showed me how he marked the correct hiding place. Those 3 stones form the constellation he called the Guardian, the same pattern that appears in our family's coat of arms. Working together, they carefully removed the concealing stones to reveal a cavity that had been carved deep into the rock wall. Inside, wrapped in oiled leather and protected by layers of waxed cloth, were the documents that Don Carlos Gutierrez had risked his life to preserve. Ledger books filled with precise handwriting, official correspondence bearing government seals, maps marked with military positions and supply routes, and what appeared to be sworn statements from witnesses to various crimes and atrocities. The sheer volume of material was staggering. This was not simply a record of business transactions, but a comprehensive intelligence operation that had been gathering information about corruption and violence throughout the territory for years. Don Carlos had apparently been documenting not just Whitfield's crimes, but a network of illegal activities involving military officers, territorial officials, and criminal gangs that had been operating with impunity across the region. Acando studied some of the documents by torchlight, his expression growing grimmer as he began to understand the scope of what they had discovered. "Your father was not just a rancher," he said quietly. "He was building a case against an entire system of corruption that reaches into the highest levels of both Mexican and American government. He believed that someday there would be honest officials who would want to know the truth," Esperanza replied, carefully rewrapping the precious documents. "He said that evil could only flourish when good people remained ignorant of what was being done in their name." But as they prepared to leave the cavern with their treasure, disaster struck with the suddenness that characterized so many life-changing moments. A sound echoed from the chimney above them, voices speaking in English, accompanied by the scraping of boots against stone. Whitfield's men had found the cave entrance and were attempting to descend into the hidden chamber. The tactical situation was desperate beyond immediate comprehension. The narrow chimney that had made the cave so secure as a hiding place now became a trap that could easily become their tomb. There was no alternative exit, no second passage that could provide escape from determined pursuers. If Whitfield's soldiers successfully negotiated the descent, Acando and Esperanza would be cornered in a space where their superior knowledge of the terrain would provide no advantage. "How many of them?" Esperanza whispered, her face pale. In the flickering torchlight, Acando listened carefully to the sounds filtering down from above, using his trained senses to interpret what he was hearing. "At least 6 men, possibly more, waiting outside. They know we are trapped down here, so they can take their time and be careful." The voices grew closer, accompanied by the sound of equipment being lowered on ropes and the careful scraping of boots finding purchase on the rock walls. These were not inexperienced soldiers, stumbling blindly through unfamiliar terrain. They were moving with the methodical precision of men who had been given detailed instructions about what to expect. "Someone who told them about this place," Esperanza said with dawning horror. "Someone who knew about my father's secrets, who understood the significance of these records, but who could have known? Only Don Miguel and I were aware of the cave's location." The answer came to them both at the same moment, a realization so devastating that it temporarily paralyzed rational thought. Don Miguel Herrera, her father's most trusted friend and ally, had been arrested by Whitfield's men 2 weeks earlier. Under interrogation, possibly torture, he had revealed the location of the hidden records. His arrest had not been about stopping illegal trading with Indians. It had been about extracting information that would lead Whitfield to this cave. The first soldier's boots appeared at the bottom of the chimney, followed immediately by the barrel of a rifle, as the man prepared to defend himself against any resistance. But instead of finding armed enemies waiting to attack, he discovered Acando and Esperanza standing calmly beside the opened cache, the precious documents arranged. On the stone floor between them, "Captain Whitfield sends his regards," the soldier said with an evil grin. "Says to tell you that your Mexican friend sang like a bird once we started asking the right questions." More men descended rapidly, until 6 armed soldiers filled the cavern, their weapons trained on the 2 fugitives who had led them on. Such an extended chase. The leader was a sergeant with cruel eyes and scars that suggested extensive combat experience. His uniform was dusty from the descent, but his rifle was clean and ready for use. "You caused us considerable trouble, miss," the sergeant said to Esperanza. "The captain has been most anxious to retrieve his property, and we have been riding hard for weeks trying to track you down. But it all ends here, in this hole in the ground where nobody will ever find your bones." But Acando was studying the tactical situation with the calculating mind of a warrior who had survived many desperate battles. The soldiers were confident, but they were also crowded together in a confined space where their superior numbers might actually work against them. The cave's acoustics would amplify the sound of gunshots, potentially causing rockfalls that could trap everyone inside. Most importantly, they were focused on their captives and not paying sufficient attention to the chimney above them. The attack, when it came, was swift and devastating. Nietzsche's warriors had followed the soldiers into the cave system, moving with the silent skill that had made Apache fighters legendary throughout the territory. The first indication of their presence was a war cry that echoed through the cavern like thunder, followed immediately by the sound of arrows striking flesh and the screams of wounded men. The confined space that had seemed like such a disadvantage suddenly became an asset as Apache warriors dropped from the chimney like deadly shadows, their knives and war clubs finding targets among soldiers who were too surprised and crowded to mount an effective defense. The battle was brief but savage, echoing with war cries and death screams that would haunt Esperanza's dreams for years to come. When silence finally returned to the cavern, 3 soldiers lay dead, and the others had fled up the chimney in panic, leaving behind weapons and equipment in their desperate haste to escape. Nietzsche himself had descended to ensure their safety, his war paint streaked with blood and his eyes gleaming with the satisfaction of a successful ambush. "We heard the gunshots and knew you were in trouble," he explained as they gathered the scattered documents. "My warriors surrounded the cave entrance and waited for the right moment to strike, but we must leave immediately. Those soldiers who escaped will bring reinforcements, possibly including artillery that could seal this cave permanently." The ascent to the surface was a nightmare of speed and desperation, with everyone understanding that their window of escape was closing rapidly. The precious documents were distributed among the warriors to ensure that even if some were lost, others would survive to fulfill Don Carlos's vision of justice. Behind them, they could already hear the sound of many horses approaching, accompanied by shouted orders and the rattle of military equipment. They emerged from the cave into a world transformed by conflict. Smoke rose from the forest below, marking where Nietzsche's warriors had engaged Whitfield's main force in a running battle designed to cover their escape. The sound of rifle fire echoed off the mountain walls, punctuated by war cries and screams that spoke of desperate combat between enemies who understood that no quarter would be asked or given. "The horses are hidden in a canyon 2 miles north," Nietzsche said as they began moving away from the cave entrance. "If we can reach them before the soldiers organize a proper pursuit, We might be able to break contact and escape into the high country where their horses cannot follow. But even as they ran through the forest, dodging between pine trees and leaping over fallen logs, Esperanza could hear the sound of pursuit growing closer. Whistles and shouts indicated that Whitfield's men were coordinating their search, using military tactics to try to surround and capture the fugitives before they could escape with the incriminating evidence. The documents she carried seemed to grow heavier with each step, but she clutched them against her chest like a mother protecting her child. These papers represented more than just evidence of Whitfield's crimes. They were the last testament of her father's work, the final gift he could give to the world he had tried so hard to improve. Losing them would mean that everyone who had died for these secrets had died for nothing. A new sound reached them through the forest, the distinctive bugle call that cavalry units use to coordinate charges. Whitfield was bringing up his main force, including mounted troops that could move much faster through the forest than fleeing people on foot. The race was becoming desperate, with the outcome likely to be determined by minutes or even seconds. There, nature called out, pointing ahead to where a narrow canyon cut into the mountainside. The horses are just beyond that ridge. If we can reach them, we have a chance. But as they approached the canyon entrance, rifle fire erupted from positions on both sides, pinning them down behind rocks and fallen trees, while soldiers moved to surround their position. Whitfield had anticipated their escape route and positioned men to intercept them at the most logical rallying point. The tactical situation had become hopeless. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped in a position where their superior knowledge of the terrain provided no significant advantage. Surrender would mean death for the Apache warriors and a fate worse than death for Esperanza. Fighting would likely result in the same outcome, but at least it would be on their own terms. "Give me the documents," Akando said quietly, his voice cutting through the sound of rifle fire. "I can create a diversion that will allow you to escape with them." "No!" Esperanza replied immediately. "We stay together. We fight together. These records belong to all of us now. They represent justice for your people as much as mine. But even as they prepared to make their final stand, a new element entered the equation. War cries echoed from multiple directions as what appeared to be an entire Apache war party swept down from the high country, attacking Whitfield's positions with the fury of warriors defending their homeland. The forest erupted in chaos as dozens of fighters engaged in close combat, transforming the methodical military operation into a savage melee where survival depended on individual skill and luck rather than superior numbers. In the confusion of battle, nature led them through gaps in the enemy line, using smoke and noise to mask their movement toward the hidden horses. Behind them, the sound of combat continued as Apache warriors held their ground against superior firepower. Buying precious time with their blood and courage, they reached the canyon where the horses waited, but even as they prepared to mount and flee, Esperanza turned back toward the sound of battle. Somewhere in that chaos, men were dying to protect the evidence she carried, sacrificing their lives so that the truth about Whitfield's crimes might survive. The weight of that responsibility settled on her shoulders like a mantle of leadership she had never sought, but could no longer refuse. The ride through the high mountain passes was a desperate flight through terrain that tested both horse and rider beyond their limits. Snow still capped the peaks despite the advancing season, and the thin air at altitude made breathing difficult for both humans and animals. But these harsh conditions also provided protection from pursuit. Whitfield's cavalry horses, bred for desert warfare, struggled in the rocky terrain and oxygen-depleted atmosphere that Akando and the Apache warriors navigated with ancestral skill. 3 days of hard riding had put considerable distance between them and their pursuers, but it had also cost them dearly. 2 of Nietzsche's warriors had succumbed to wounds sustained in the forest battle, their bodies wrapped in blankets and left in sacred places according to Apache custom. The horses were exhausted, several showing signs of lameness that would make continued flight increasingly difficult. Most critically, their supplies of food and water were running dangerously low. Esperanza had not spoken much during the flight. Her attention focused entirely on protecting the precious documents that had cost so many lives to obtain. She rode with the leather-wrapped bundles clutched against her chest, never allowing them out of her sight, even during the brief stops they made to rest the horses. The weight of responsibility for these papers had transformed her from a victim seeking personal revenge into something approaching a sacred guardian of truth. But the physical and emotional toll was becoming evident in ways that concerned Akando deeply. She had lost weight during their flight, her face becoming gaunt with exhaustion and stress. The brand on her thigh, which had been healing well in the safety of their hidden canyon, was showing signs of renewed infection from the constant riding and poor conditions. Most worrying of all, she had developed a fever that seemed to worsen with each passing day. "We need to find shelter and proper medical care," Akando told Nietzsche during one of their brief conferences. "She is pushing herself beyond her physical limits, and the documents will do no good if she dies before we can deliver them to someone with the authority to act." Nietzsche studied the terrain around them with the practiced eye of someone who had spent his entire life reading the subtle signs that meant the difference between life and death in the wilderness. They were approaching the borders of Pueblo territory, lands where ancient settlements had thrived for centuries and where there might be people willing to provide aid to refugees fleeing military persecution. "There is a village, half a day's ride from here," he said finally, "Santo Domingo Pueblo. My people have traded there for generations, and their leaders understand the difference between Apache raiders and Apache people seeking help. But reaching them means crossing open country where we will be visible to any pursuit." The decision was made more urgent by developments none of them had anticipated. As they crested a ridge that provided a panoramic view of the valleys below, they spotted something that made their blood run cold, a column of smoke rising from the direction of Santo Domingo Pueblo. Not the gentle wisps that would indicate normal cooking fires, but the thick black smoke that meant buildings were burning. Through the spyglass that one of the warriors carried, they could see military activity in the valley. Soldiers, systematically searching buildings and questioning inhabitants with the brutal efficiency that characterized Whitfield's operations. The captain had apparently decided that if he could not capture the fugitives directly, he would pressure every potential ally until someone provided information about their whereabouts. "He is making war on everyone," Nietzsche said grimly. "Not just Apache, not just Mexican ranchers, but even the Pueblo people who have never raised weapons against anyone. This man has become a plague upon the entire territory." The sight of innocent villagers being terrorized by soldiers who were supposed to protect them triggered something primal in Esperanza's character. Despite her fever and exhaustion, she straightened in her saddle and spoke with a voice that carried the authority of someone who had looked death in the face and chosen to keep fighting. "We cannot run forever," she said. "Every day we delay, more innocent people suffer because of what I carry. These documents contain proof of crimes that reach far beyond just Captain Whitfield. They expose a network of corruption that touches officials in Santa Fe, territorial administrators, even people in Washington. But all that evidence means nothing if we never find a way to present it to someone who can act." Her words sparked a heated discussion among the Apache warriors about tactics and objectives that revealed deep philosophical divisions within their own community. Some argued for continued flight, believing that survival was more important than justice and that engaging in direct confrontation with military forces would only result in more Apache deaths. Others insisted that the evidence they carried could be used to expose crimes against their people and possibly prevent future massacres. But it was Akando who proposed the solution that would define their final course of action. His knowledge of both Apache culture and the broader territorial political situation allowed him to see possibilities that others had missed. "There is someone in Albuquerque who might help us," he said. "Not a territorial official or military officer, but a newspaper editor named James Morrison, who has been writing articles critical of military excesses against civilian populations. He has enemies in high places because he refuses to print only the stories that officials want people to read." The idea of approaching a civilian journalist rather than government authorities was radical enough to spark intense debate. Newspapers were still relatively rare in the territory, and most editors were either controlled by political factions or too intimidated by military pressure to print controversial stories. But Morrison had built a reputation for independence that might make him willing to examine evidence that other potential allies would refuse to consider. "My father mentioned Morrison several times," Esperanza said, her fever-brightened eyes, focusing with renewed hope. "He said Morrison was one of the few Americans who understood that the territory could only prosper if all its peoples were treated fairly. If anyone would be willing to publish the truth about Whitfield's crimes, it would be him." The journey to Albuquerque required crossing territories controlled by multiple hostile forces, but it also offered opportunities that had not existed in their previous flight through sparsely populated mountain regions. The town was large enough to provide concealment among civilian populations, diverse enough that Apache and Mexican faces would not automatically attract suspicion, and connected to communication networks that could spread information rapidly throughout the territory and beyond. But reaching Albuquerque meant abandoning the safety of the high country and descending into valleys where military patrols operated with impunity. It meant trusting their lives to people they had never met, gambling everything on the hope that one honest journalist would be willing to risk his career and possibly his life to expose the truth about systematic corruption and violence. The descent from the mountains took 2 days of careful navigation through terrain that offered both opportunities and threats in equal measure. Canyon systems provided concealment from distant observation, but also created potential traps where small groups of riders could be ambushed by superior forces. Desert washes offered fast travel, but left clear tracks that experienced trackers could follow for days. On their second night of travel toward Albuquerque, disaster struck in a form none of them had anticipated. Esperanza, weakened by fever and the constant stress of their flight, collapsed while attempting to care for her horse during their evening rest stop. Akando found her unconscious beside a stream where she had apparently been trying to refill their water containers. Her condition had deteriorated far more rapidly than anyone had realized. The fever that had seemed manageable during their mountain flight had spiked dangerously high, and the infection from her branded wound had spread throughout her body. Without immediate medical attention from someone with more resources than they could provide in the wilderness, she might not survive another day of hard travel. "There is a Hispanic settlement 8 miles south of here," one of Naicha's warriors reported after scouting the surrounding area. "Small, maybe 20 families, but they have a curandera, a healer woman who knows medicine. She might be able to help." The decision to approach the settlement required weighing desperate needs against equally desperate risks. Hispanic communities throughout the territory lived in constant fear of both Apache raids and military retaliation for providing aid to anyone the authorities considered hostile. Approaching them with an unconscious woman and a war party of armed Apache warriors might provoke exactly the kind of violent response they were trying to avoid. But Akando had reached the point where protecting Esperanza's life took precedence over all other considerations, including the safety of the documents that had cost so many lives to obtain. If she died, the evidence would be meaningless, because she was the only person who fully understood its significance and could explain its implications to potential allies. The settlement was called Agua Dulce, a cluster of adobe houses surrounded by small fields where corn and beans grew, with the help of an ingenious irrigation system that brought water from springs in the nearby hills. The inhabitants had clearly seen the approaching riders long before they arrived, and the universal reaction was fear. Children disappeared into houses, men gathered whatever weapons they could find, and women began preparing for the worst. But the settlement's curandera, an elderly woman named Doña Esperanza, whose name created an immediate bond with her patient, approached the situation with the practical wisdom that came from a lifetime of treating injuries without regard for their political or ethnic origins. After examining the unconscious woman, she announced that the infection was serious but treatable if they acted quickly and if the patient received proper rest and nutrition. "She can stay here while she recovers," the curandera declared, with the authority of someone accustomed to making life and death decisions. "But you Apache warriors must leave. Your presence here will bring soldiers, and that will endanger everyone in the village." The ultimatum forced Akando to confront a choice that struck at the very core of his identity and values. Leaving Esperanza meant abandoning the woman he had sworn to protect, potentially forever, but staying meant exposing innocent villagers to military retaliation that could result in deaths far more numerous than those they were trying to prevent. It was Esperanza herself who resolved the dilemma, awakening briefly from her fevered delirium to grab Akando's hand with surprising strength. "Take the documents," she whispered. "Find Morrison. Tell him the story. Make sure the truth is published even if I do not survive to see it." The transfer of responsibility was both practical and symbolic. No longer was she the guardian of evidence while he provided protection, but rather they had become equal partners in a mission that transcended personal survival. The documents that had defined their relationship were now his burden to carry, just as her recovery was now the responsibility of people they barely knew. Nietzsche's warriors prepared to resume their journey to Albuquerque, but not before establishing a communication system that would allow them to monitor Esperanza's condition and coordinate future actions. Apache hand signals and smoke signs would carry messages between the settlement and the town, ensuring that Akando would know immediately if her condition worsened or if military forces discovered her location. The parting between Akando and Esperanza was conducted with the stoic dignity that characterized people who understood that survival sometimes required sacrifice. No dramatic declarations of love or promises of reunion, just a quiet exchange of looks that communicated everything that needed to be said about commitment, trust, and the hope that justice might eventually triumph over cruelty. "If we succeed," Akando said softly, "your father's dream will be fulfilled. If we fail, at least we will have tried to do what was right." "Do not fail," Esperanza replied with the fierce intensity that had carried her through every trial they had faced together. "Too many people have died for this truth to remain." Buried, the journey to Albuquerque without Esperanza felt fundamentally different from everything that had come before. What had begun as a rescue mission had evolved into something approaching a holy crusade, with the success or failure of their efforts determining whether the deaths of Don Carlos Gutierrez and his family would ultimately have meaning. As they rode through the pre-dawn darkness toward their final destination, Akando reflected on how dramatically his life had changed since finding a broken woman beside a desert stream. He had expected to save her life and perhaps find some purpose for his own existence in the process. Instead, he had become the guardian of secrets that could reshape the political landscape of the entire territory. The lights of Albuquerque appeared on the horizon just as the sun began to rise over the Sandia Mountains. Somewhere in that growing town was James Morrison, the journalist who represented their last hope for transforming evidence into justice. Whether he would prove to be the ally they desperately needed, or just another disappointment in a world filled with corruption and cowardice, remained to be discovered. Albuquerque in 1847 was a town caught between worlds, its adobe buildings and Spanish colonial architecture serving as backdrop for an increasingly complex mixture of cultures and conflicting loyalties. Mexican families who had controlled trade and land for generations found themselves adapting to American territorial authority, while Apache bands continued to raid settlements that they considered invaders on ancestral hunting grounds. Into this volatile environment walked Akando, carrying documents that could expose corruption, reaching into the highest levels of both military and civilian authority. The offices of the Territory Herald occupied a modest building on the town's main plaza, distinguished from surrounding shops and cantinas only by the hand-painted sign that announced James Morrison's commitment to truth without fear or favor. The windows were reinforced with iron bars that spoke of previous attempts at intimidation, and bullet holes in the wooden doorframe suggested that not everyone appreciated Morrison's dedication to investigative journalism. Akando had spent 3 days observing the newspaper office, learning the patterns of daily activity and identifying potential threats before making his approach. Morrison was a man of regular habits, arriving each morning at dawn to begin setting type for the weekly edition and staying late into the evening to write articles by lamplight. He worked alone most of the time, employing only a young Mexican boy who swept floors and delivered papers throughout the town. But Morrison's isolation also made him vulnerable to the kind of pressure that territorial officials could bring to bear when they wanted problematic stories suppressed. Twice during Akando's surveillance, men in military uniforms had visited the newspaper office, their conversations with Morrison growing heated enough to be audible from across the plaza. The journalist's body language during these encounters suggested he was under considerable stress. The decision to approach Morrison directly rather than attempting some elaborate subterfuge was based partly on practical considerations and partly on Akando's assessment of the man's character. The editor had built his reputation on fearless reporting about controversial subjects, which suggested he might be receptive to evidence of official misconduct. More importantly, their time was running out. Every day of delay increased the chances that Whitfield would locate and silence potential witnesses. Akando entered the newspaper office just after sunset, when the evening's work was winding down and the streets were relatively empty of potential observers. Morrison looked up from his typesetting with the weary expression of someone accustomed to unexpected visitors bearing bad news. His initial reaction to seeing an Apache warrior in his office was controlled surprise rather than fear, which immediately established him as different from most territorial residents. "I assume you are not here to place an advertisement," Morrison said dryly, his hands remaining visible and non-threatening, despite the obvious tension of the situation. "What can the Territory Herald do for you?" "You can help me tell the truth about Captain Marcus Whitfield," Akando replied, in carefully practiced English. "I have evidence that he has been committing crimes against both Apache people and Mexican settlers for his own profit." The name Whitfield caused Morrison's expression to change dramatically, shifting from wary curiosity to intense interest. He gestured for Akando to sit down, then moved to the windows to ensure they were not being observed. The precautions suggested that Morrison was already aware of Whitfield's reputation and understood the dangers associated with investigating his activities. "I have been trying to gather information about Captain Whitfield for months," Morrison admitted. "There have been rumors, stories that never quite added up to provable facts, witnesses who disappeared before they could give testimony, documents that vanished from official files. But no one has been willing to go on record with specific accusations." "Then you will be interested in these," Acando said, carefully unwrapping the bundles of documents that Don Carlos Gutierrez had died to protect. "These are detailed records of Whitfield's crimes, maintained by a Mexican rancher who was killed when he refused to give up his daughter." Morrison's eyes widened as he began examining the papers, his journalist's instincts immediately recognizing the significance of what he was seeing. Ledger entries documenting the sale of confiscated Apache horses to Mexican bandits, correspondence revealing kickback arrangements with territorial supply contractors, sworn statements from witnesses to unprovoked attacks on peaceful settlements. It was a comprehensive indictment of systematic corruption. "This is incredible," Morrison breathed, his hands trembling slightly as he turned pages filled with damning evidence. "If even half of these allegations can be verified, it would destroy Whitfield's career and implicate dozens of other officials. But where is the rancher who compiled these records? Why is he not here to present this information himself?" "Carlos Gutierrez and his family were murdered by Whitfield's men," Acando explained. "His daughter escaped and led me to the hidden cave where these documents were stored. She is currently recovering from injuries sustained during our flight from pursuing soldiers." The story that emerged over the following hours was unlike anything Morrison had encountered during his years of frontier journalism. As Acando described the massacre at the Gutierrez Ranch, Esperanza's branding and escape, their discovery of the hidden records, and the running battle through the mountains, the editor took detailed notes and asked the kind of probing questions that established his professional credibility. But it was when Morrison began cross-referencing the documentary evidence with his own accumulated knowledge about territorial politics that the true scope of the conspiracy became apparent. Whitfield was not operating alone. He was part of a network that included territorial judges, land office officials, and supply contractors who had been systematically looting the region while using Indian raids and Mexican banditry as cover. For their crimes, the implications are staggering, Morrison said as dawn light began filtering through the newspaper office windows. This evidence could bring down half the territorial administration and probably result in congressional investigations, but publishing it will also make me a target for people with considerable resources and no scruples about using violence. "Then you will not publish the story?" Acando asked, trying to keep the disappointment from his voice. "I did not say that," Morrison replied firmly. "But I need more than just documentary evidence. I need living witnesses who can testify to what they saw. The daughter you mentioned, Esperanza Gutierrez, would be the most credible witness because she is the sole survivor of the massacre. Can you arrange for me to interview her?" The request presented both an opportunity and a dilemma that Acando had not anticipated. Bringing Morrison to meet Esperanza would allow the journalist to gather first-hand testimony that would make his story unassailable. But it would also expose her location to someone whose trustworthiness, despite positive first impressions, remained unproven. If Morrison proved unreliable or if the interview was discovered by Whitfield's agents, Esperanza could be captured or killed. She is still recovering from serious injuries, Acando said carefully. Moving her would be dangerous, and bringing strangers to her location might compromise the safety of people who are helping her heal. "Then I will come to her," Morrison said without hesitation. "I have traveled throughout this territory gathering stories, and I understand the need for discretion. If this woman is willing to tell her story on the record, I will publish it along with the documentary evidence in a way that will force territorial and federal authorities to take action. The journey back to Agua Dulce took 2 days, with Morrison proving surprisingly capable of handling desert travel despite his profession keeping him office-bound most of the time. He rode well enough to keep pace with Akando's more demanding schedule, complained little about harsh conditions, and demonstrated the kind of physical courage that his journalism career had clearly required in a territory where asking the wrong questions could result in violent retaliation. But it was Morrison's reaction to meeting Esperanza that convinced Akando they had found a true ally in their quest for justice. The journalist took one look at the branded woman who still bore the physical and emotional scars of Whitfield's cruelty, and his professional detachment gave way to obvious anger at the systematic nature of the violence that had been perpetrated against innocent civilians. "I want you to tell me everything," Morrison said gently, settling beside Esperanza's bed with his notebook and pencil ready. "Not just the facts that can be proven in court, but how it felt to experience these horrors. People need to understand not just what happened, but what it means to live through such calculated cruelty." Esperanza's testimony, delivered over the course of several hours with frequent pauses for rest and emotional recovery, was the most powerful piece of evidence Morrison had encountered in his entire journalism career. Her detailed recollection of the massacre, her description of the branding ceremony that had been designed to destroy her humanity, and her account of the subsequent flight through hostile territory created a narrative that transformed abstract accusations into visceral human drama. But perhaps most importantly, her explanation of her father's motivation for keeping detailed records revealed the broader context that gave meaning to individual acts of violence. Don Carlos Gutierrez had not simply been documenting crimes for personal revenge. He had been building a case for fundamental reform of territorial administration, believing that systematic corruption could only be defeated by systematic exposure of the truth. "Your father was not just a rancher," Morrison told Esperanza after completing his interview. "He was conducting the most comprehensive investigation of territorial corruption that has ever been attempted. These records represent years of careful work that could change how this entire region is governed, but only if people read the story and demand action," Esperanza replied, her voice still weak, but her determination undiminished. "My family died to protect this evidence. Akando has risked his life to help me preserve it. Apache warriors have shed their blood to keep it from being destroyed. None of that sacrifice will mean anything if the story is published and then forgotten." Morrison understood the challenge she was describing. Frontier newspapers had limited circulation, and territorial officials had considerable power to suppress stories they found threatening. Publishing the Whitfield exposé would require more than just good journalism. It would require a coordinated campaign to ensure the story reached audiences beyond local readership. "I have contacts with newspapers in Santa Fe and Denver," Morrison explained. "If we coordinate the publication of this story across multiple territories simultaneously, it will be much harder for officials to suppress or ignore. The evidence is strong enough that Eastern newspapers might pick up the story, especially if we emphasize the broader implications for how territories are administered." The plan that emerged from their discussions was ambitious beyond anything any of them had originally envisioned. Rather than simply exposing Whitfield's individual crimes, they would use the documentary evidence to reveal the systematic nature of corruption throughout territorial administration. The story would be published as a multi-part series, with each installment focusing on different aspects of the conspiracy and building toward demands for congressional investigation. But even as they planned their campaign for justice, events were moving beyond their control in ways that would force immediate action rather than careful preparation. A dust cloud on the horizon announced the approach of a large group of mounted men, and the sound of barking dogs suggested that Whitfield's trackers had finally located their hiding place. The curandera who had been caring for Esperanza took one look at the approaching riders and began shouting orders in rapid Spanish, organizing the village's defenses with the efficiency of someone who had survived previous military raids. Children were herded into the church, valuables were hidden or buried, and the men gathered whatever weapons they possessed while expecting the worst. "They found us," Esperanza said, struggling to rise from her bed despite her obvious weakness. "Somehow, they tracked us here. We have endangered everyone who helped us." But Akando was already moving, gathering weapons, and checking the documentary evidence to ensure it would not be lost if they were forced to flee. The irony of the situation was bitter. Just when they had found someone capable of telling their story to the world, they were about to be silenced by the very man they were trying to expose. Morrison, to his credit, showed no inclination to abandon the story or flee from the approaching danger. Instead, he carefully wrapped his notes and the most crucial documents in oiled cloth, preparing to preserve the evidence regardless of what happened to the people who had gathered it. "If we do not survive this," he told Akando grimly, "I want you to know that this story will be published anyway. I have already sent preliminary reports to my contacts in other cities. Even if Whitfield kills all of us, the truth about his crimes will eventually reach people with the power to act." The sound of approaching horses grew louder, accompanied by shouted orders and the rattle of military equipment that announced Whitfield had brought a substantial force to ensure there would be no escape this time. The final confrontation between justice and corruption was about to begin, with the outcome determining whether the sacrifices of so many would ultimately prove meaningful. Captain Marcus Whitfield rode into Agua Dulce at the head of 40 mounted soldiers, his face bearing the expression of a man who had finally cornered his prey after an extended and frustrating hunt. But there was something different about his demeanor, a desperation that suggested he understood the stakes, had risen far beyond simple pursuit of escaped property. He was no longer just trying to recapture a branded woman, he was fighting to prevent the exposure of crimes that would destroy his career and possibly cost him his life. "Surrender the documents and the woman," Whitfield shouted across the plaza, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to immediate obedience. "You are surrounded and outnumbered. Further resistance will only result in unnecessary deaths." But the response came not from Akando or Morrison, but from Esperanza herself, who had struggled to her feet and now stood in the doorway of the curandera's house with the dignity of someone who had already survived the worst that could be done to her. The brand on her thigh was visible through the torn fabric of her dress, but she wore it now not as a mark of shame, but as a badge of survival. "I am Esperanza Gutierrez," she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the plaza. "Daughter of Don Carlos Gutierrez, whom you murdered along with my mother and brother. I carry the evidence of your crimes, and the world will know what you have done." The standoff that followed was unlike any confrontation Akando had ever experienced, charged with a moral weight that transcended simple questions of survival or military tactics. This was no longer just a battle between individuals, but a contest between competing visions of what the territory could become, whether it would continue to be controlled by corruption and violence, or whether justice and truth would finally prevail. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.